We do have time for further debate. I recognize the member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I am glad to have the opportunity to stand and offer a few comments on Bill 23, which is titled by this government the More Homes Built Faster Act of 2022. This is the second time that it's come before the House since it's been to and through committee and back. So for the folks at home who blinked, yes, things are moving that fast. And unfortunately, we aren't seeing the changes that we'd like to see with it having come back from committee. And my colleague from University Rosedale, for anyone who missed her speech and is very interested in knowing and understanding the housing file, they should check that out. Really appreciated the remarks, and I will let them stand for themselves and not go into what could have or should have happened at committee. But I will talk about the concerns across our communities. What we're hearing from folks about this bill, which the government, wants everybody to wear the "We're Building Homes" T-shirt, and the fact of the matter is, we do need more homes. We do need affordable homes. We need to see that a range in supply, absolutely. But the problem is, this bill makes a mess of that landscape, so to speak. The bill would download most land use planning and approval authority onto lower-tier municipalities, while limiting the ability of municipalities to collect development charges for certain growth-related infrastructure costs. The bill also allows the government to limit municipal protections for tenants facing displacement due to redevelopment and severely reduces the power of conservation authorities to protect wetlands, biodiversity, and ecological health. So that's sort of the banner. That's what we're breaking it down about today. But I wanted to read something that puts it into people's speak. Sorry, I'm disciplining my colleagues. Back to you, Speaker. I didn't mean to bring my teacher look today, but anyway, here we are. Okay, back to the bill. Speaker, this can get confusing for people, and I'm not trying to condescend. There are a lot of moving parts in this bill. And when the government says, we need homes, and everybody does the nod of, yes, of course we need homes, but I'm going to highlight some challenges in this bill that are going to make things, I would say, more problematic and will not streamline the process the way that the government has said that they will, whether that's just a mistake on their part, although we heard it at committee. There are ways that this government could have improved, well, not just this legislation. This legislation is a bag of malarkey, but there are things that could help us to have the homes and the responsible planning that needs to happen. So here is from an article from The Pointer. So Bill 23 is ecological insanity, implodes sustainable urban planning and unhinged. Give over.
You not read the Brampton Pointer?
Okay, I'm going to invite everybody to not interrupt me because, as per the standing orders, enough.
Would everyone please come to order? Continue.
So, quoting here, the PC government has proposed unprecedented changes to how land use planning is done across Ontario. In an omnibus piece of legislation introduced last week, the Premier is providing his largest gift to the development lobby that helped him land his job in the first place. Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act, creates an open season on critical ecosystems and habitats in Ontario, a fundamental shift in land use policy that will lead to the destruction of wetlands, woodlots, and other critical habitat, and effectively sets fire to the province's carbon reduction targets. The legislation mirrors what subdivision developers have been aggressively lobbying for, a bill that paves the way, literally, for more land-gobbling sprawl across southern Ontario. One of the quotes in the article from Tim Gray, who's the Executive Director of Environmental Defence, said, quote, "It's pretty much a catastrophic attack on planning that looks to blow up the system, and that, of course, is going to have devastating impacts on the environment, but also on the livability and sustainability of our city." End quote. I'm going to read from my regional chair. So Chair Henry put out a statement on Bill 23, the province's most recent housing supply bill, and some of the pieces of his statement is that, quote, while we welcome potential changes to help streamline processes, there are concerns with Provincial Bill 23. It has proposed numerous changes to the Planning Act and Development Charges Act that, if passed, will significantly impact how municipal governments plan for and recover the costs associated with growth. It has unintended consequences and widespread implications that impact all Ontarians economically, socially, and environmentally. He goes on to say, successful urban planning also requires a vision, a bigger picture. It's about shaping communities that balance growth, services, and protecting our environment with our residents. We need to protect our wetlands to mitigate flooding and to take care of the woodlands that support the air we breathe. Ensuring a safe, prosperous, and healthy future is what we've been elected to do. Goes on to say, and we believe that growth should pay for growth. Development charges have traditionally been collected to fund large infrastructure projects required for new builds. Without them, municipalities are forced to cover the cost through increased property taxes and water and sewer rates, a burden on existing residents and businesses. We encourage the province to engage in further dialogue with municipalities and residents to help ensure the environment and the health and safety of all Ontarians remains at the forefront. End quote. We did talk about what happened at committee. AMO, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, who normally this government tends to stand up and read their comments in debate, but interestingly they haven't for this one. But part of their submission on Bill 23 is this. Quote, AMO shares the concerns expressed by Conservation Ontario that the changes proposed in Bill 23 will not meet the goals for increasing housing supply and will instead increase the risks to life and property for Ontario residents. The diminished roles of conservation authorities could also lead to more development being located in natural hazards, higher costs as a result of property damage due to flooding or other climate change events, increased burden on municipal partners, and the decline of the ecosystem approach currently applied through the established integrated watershed management lens. Municipalities have successfully relied on the benefits of a long-standing conservation authority partnership which has used local watershed science to guide decision-making. Bill 23 places new responsibilities on municipalities related to natural hazards and natural resources that they are unprepared for and under-resourced to take on. End quote. It's a long submission. I would encourage the government members to read it. But anyway, and connected to that is what I will share from my local conservation authority. So in my area, it's the Central Lake Ontario Conservation Authority. Yes, famously known for Purple Woods and their phenomenal maple syrup. I had kind of, not a funny joke, but had said to them, you know, once the government is finished with all the conservation authorities, you know, the only thing that they will be allowed to do is make maple syrup. But considering that that's one of the fees and that they may have to freeze their fees, they may actually, who knows. So, and I don't mean to make light of it, but the conservation authorities, so this bill makes some changes, and I'm just going to put this into kind of everyday language, and then I'll read what they have said, which is probably a little more helpful. But what I'm going to explain is what I want folks at home to understand. This bill has made changes so that they can't enter into any agreement about planning. So they could still enter into agreements with a municipality, like maybe a tree planting agreement kind of thing, but not about planning. They're literally not allowed to offer input. So if a municipality, as happens all the time, goes to a conservation authority and their expertise and says, hey, I have a developer who has got a suggested subdivision here. Can you put eyes on this and flag any problems? And the conservation authority would do that with their experts and planners and provide that feedback, and the municipality doesn't have to do anything with that. They can ignore it. The council can override any input. The conservation authorities actually can't get in the way of, okay? They were allowed to offer input. And then the municipality could decide what to do with permitting and what to, you know, what information to give to the developer, like, hey, woo, here's a wetland. You don't want your houses to sink, or what have you, right? So now The municipalities are still required, by their rules and whatnot, to ensure that they meet the requirements under the the Planning Act and their environmental requirements, but they're not allowed to talk to the conservation authorities. Not allowed. That's now not allowed. So now you've got community leaders who have to still have this, still have the environmental lens put on it, but they're not allowed to talk to the experts. So now they're going to have to figure out how to build that capacity in their own planning departments. So maybe it's hire someone, or use a planner they currently have and have them suddenly develop the expertise or whatnot. So I don't know how that makes the process faster. And I maybe oversimplified that, but that's the gist. So now they are forbidden from getting their input, recognizing that the CA, a conservation authority, could provide that input when asked, and it didn't even have to be heeded. So tell me how this makes it faster. I'm willing to bet you can't, because it won't. But it was on the wish list of, I don't know, right? Was this on Silvio's wish list? I don't know. So the Central Lake Ontario Conservation Authority has said basically what I said. This amendment would prohibit conservation authorities from offering our expertise on ecology, natural heritage, wetlands, and biodiversity for proposals under prescribed acts such as the Planning Act. We are concerned that the proposed amendment will have unintended consequences that will lead to slower and more costly approvals and environmental degradation. And the thing is, the conservation authorities have been building relationships with municipalities. And we've, through the years known that there have been, challenges to be overcome. But for the most part, they have worked out through the years a relationship that works. And to just, punch that relationship in the face and say, you're not allowed to talk anymore, is so weird and problematic. As they have said, we have well-established practices and locally supported agreements with our municipalities that provides effective and timeline-compliant advice. Without the ability to comment on development applications, there would be information gaps resulting in slower development approvals and added costs to developers to fill these information gaps. Municipalities would need to establish alternative capacity for environmental review that would be less cost-effective than the service conservation authorities currently provide. Without Conservation Authority review of development applications, there would be an increased risk of environmental impacts. The proposed amendments will deprive our multiple municipal partners of the locally grown expertise they want and need and rely on daily to understand and implement environmental planning considerations. It will lead to fewer homes built slower and thereby directly undermine the objectives of the government's housing plans. Also of concern are proposed changes that could negatively impact our ability to protect people and property from flooding and erosion. This will result in longer response times, increased costs, and an increased risk to people and property from natural hazards. Municipalities will also assume sole liability for the impact of development on natural hazards within municipal boundaries and on neighbouring upstream and downstream communities. So what they have said is, succinctly, we respectfully recommend that development authorized under the Planning Act not be exempted from a requirement for a permit under the Conservation Authority Act, and that all current Conservation Authority hazard-related responsibilities remain unchanged. Guys, this letter wasn't just written by tree huggers, okay? Because I know every time we talk about the environment, you kind of roll your eyes or kind of have that look of, oh, you guys are in the way of progress. But the people who signed on to this letter are the folks on the board. Just like at every conservation authority, they're elected members of our community who have a finger on the pulse of what is needed and what is challenging our municipalities. Whether that's councillors, mayors, like in this case, the Mayor of Clarington, the Mayor of Whitby, the Mayor of Oshawa, and the Chair of the Central Lake Ontario Conservation Authority, Bob Chapman. Right? These are folks who actually know what they're talking about. I would also argue that so do tree huggers. Just saying. But moving on, Phil Pothin, Ontario Environment Program Manager from Environmental Defence, He went on to also say, to break it down about planning, this bill's attack on regional planning is counterproductive for housing affordability as well as being environmentally disastrous. Devolving planning decisions to lower-tier municipalities would produce development that is more scattered and thus much more environmentally harmful, but also more uncoordinated and expensive. So what he is saying is, quote, this is precisely the opposite of what's needed at a time when we need to preserve every acre of farmland and habitat and use scarce construction materials, construction labor, equipment, and supporting infrastructure to maximize the number of well-designed and low-cost homes and transform existing post-World War II subdivisions into public transit supporting complete communities. The idea of, so the harm that this bill does to that coordinated regional approach doesn't make sense to me, and I would ask that the government kind of explain that. Because the idea of coordinated strategies across regions, doesn't that make sense in terms of resources, in terms of initiatives and the outcomes? Better planning. So in this case it says, no, we're just going to give it to the lower tier. So as it said, maybe scattered, but disparate, right? How does that improve? How does that improve things? I realize it was probably also on the wish list, right? Like, nobody likes having to answer, like folks who are self-serving don't want to serve others, like, and so I think when you've got interests that are profit-driven, they want to earn profit. They want to not have to answer to environmental voices or regional plans, but that doesn't mean that they should, right? Like, anyway, the letter, a 7-page document signed by more than 125 organizations and almost 100 individuals. This is the media statement about a letter that came out on November 21st. A massive coalition of groups unite to condemn the government's secret sprawl plans. Today, a rare coalition of farmers, housing advocates, urban planners, environmentalists, labour unions, healthcare workers, and community groups from across Ontario united and released a damning statement of the province's recently proposed recipe for sprawl, Bill 23, and the proposal to remove precious farmland and natural areas from the protected Greenbelt. David Crombie, former Mayor of Toronto and former Chair of the Provincial Greenbelt Council, had said, I'm profoundly disturbed by the government's proposed actions. They won't solve the housing crisis, but they will make it harder to fix our existing neighbourhoods, towns and cities, as well as protect the farmland and natural areas that sustain them. If the Premier doesn't put the brakes on these ill-considered plans, we'll have more sprawl and much less local food and protection against flooding and the climate crisis, end quote. Anyway, a 7-page letter, and they've outlined that altogether this bill, taken together, the changes would do little or nothing to address the shortage of truly affordable housing, facilitate expensive urban sprawl and inappropriate high-rises at the expense of more diverse housing types designed for all stages of life and ranges of income, divert limited construction materials and labour away from building mixed and affordable housing, and direct them instead towards sprawl development, remove from the Greenbelt thousands of acres of valuable natural areas and agricultural land and turn them into sprawl development, undermine the protections of wetlands, woodlands, rivers, streams, and wildlife habitat across Ontario, destroy key land use planning processes that Ontario municipalities, conservation authorities, and residents need in order to protect, manage, and plan for climate-resilient ecosystems and communities, and create an ecologically vulnerable Swiss cheese, Greenbelt, by allowing land speculators to develop the lands that the government would have removed from Greenbelt protections. Speaker, I'm running out of time here, and I have letters from the community. And for those of us who have staff and community offices, and I'm looking at some of the government members, you would know, if you check your email, that our inboxes are filled with people concerned and protesting this on the environmental side, on the planning side, because it's all one and the same. We want livable, healthful communities. We want our municipal governments that we elect to be able to make decisions based on the growth plans, on responsible development, factoring in green space, yes, but factoring in floods and the potential for, that mess that a property owner could be faced with when the developer doesn't have anybody watching over them and just puts a house on a swamp. Are we allowed to call it swamps? We're not allowed to call it wetlands anymore because this bill changes all of the designations, but it comes to the same. We need healthy communities.
It is now time for questions. I recognize the member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Thank you, Speaker, and I appreciate the comments of the member from Oshawa. And you know what? I know we've often heard some very called heartbreaking stories about our constituents, Ontarians who have been priced out of the housing market, unable to find a home that would meet their needs. For the last 8 years, I was a town councillor in the town of Tecumseh, and I received a number of them on my own for infill developments. The buyer's own family was one case. They wanted to build a shed for the growing family to help store and add a bedroom within. They refused because of a lack of clarity as a result of the Gilmore decision, which gave some uncertainty about when a conservation authority could issue a permit. And there were cases on James Crescent, Dillon Drive, and Shane Street in my former ward where, for over 2 years, permits could not be issued by the conservation authority. So, Speaker, will the opposition let us know why this status quo, which prolongs approval delays and passing these excessive construction costs onto hardworking Ontarians, young families, students and seniors, is the better option ahead of us?
Response?
Thank you. And I appreciate the question, but I also appreciate hearing some of our backstories in this room. For example, I didn't know his background in terms of municipal politics. We are hearing from real people who want a safe place to live, but who want something that they can afford. And whether that is about affordable rent, or whether that is, a distinct house, with a backyard and a porch, people want to be able to afford a place to live. But he raised permits. So one of the things in our neck of the woods and across the province are permits that are just sitting there, that the city or the municipality issues permits and then the developer just holds them, right, and doesn't develop.
Response?
And there may be reasons why, but when there aren't, except for greed, how come we don't see anything in this bill that would keep that from happening or protect the folks who are waiting and waiting and waiting?
Further questions? I recognize the member for Davenport.
Thank you, and I want to thank the member for her excellent comments on this legislation. One of the number one reasons I'm getting emails from people right now who are deeply concerned about this legislation from all across the province is that they're asking and they're desperate, how can we stop this? What can we do? I wondered if the member would care to comment a little bit on, what can the average Ontarian do right now to get this government to change direction on this really harmful legislation?
Back to the member from Oshawa.
Oh man, I don't like that question because it's like I don't want to ever kind of characterize them as a juggernaut, right? Because that would make you feel like they can't be stopped. Juggernaut, whatever. But I don't know, because in Oshawa and the Durham region, we had a heck of a fight on our hands with this government and other players to save Duffins Creek, and we did. We were so excited. Amazon threw us a bone and we saved it. And then the developers, I think they said it was like rogue farmers. So I don't know, some pirate farmer came and tilled the entire 90% of that protected land in the middle of the night because they're gonna do what they're gonna do, and which is heartbreaking. And wrong, but it's what happens. And we have given, this is a wish list to, folks who asked for it through the years of this premier and this government. So I don't know, maybe if they pool their resources and they've got more money than the developers, maybe, I would say call their MPPs, but I'm hearing with all the rallies at their offices, some of them don't even have staff, right? So I don't know what they should do. Try.
Further questions? I recognize the member for Eglinton Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for her comments. Although I didn't appreciate all of the things that I think were imputing motive against the government and probably were not parliamentary. One of the things that I'm very excited about in this legislation is the fact that it will make affordable housing much more likely because of the development charge provisions. And I just wanted to quote from RENA, which is a great organization that I've had some experience with. Brian Keshen, the CEO, said, RENA is looking forward to working with the Minister on the implementation of this transformative legislation, ensuring that deeply affordable housing will be a reality by creating waivers of development charges, fees, charges and levies on non-profit affordable housing projects. Ontario is setting the stage for more affordable housing. Doesn't the member think that this is a great initiative to ensure we have more affordable housing, which I know everyone has been asking for?
Back to the member.
Thanks, Speaker. Nothing in this legislation deals with affordable housing. Nothing in this legislation deals with affordable housing or ensures affordable housing. And you can clear the land and you can clear the path and you can rename, not you, sorry, through the Speaker. This government can rename a wetland like land formerly known as wet or damp land or moist meadow. You can rename it, but that land becomes worth so much more on paper. That developer is like is laughing all the way to the bank and is not on the hook to build anything. None of them have to build anything. So some of them will. Hopefully they build affordable houses, affordable homes that maybe they all just wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to make the world a better place. But
Response?
You haven't put the assurances in there. Right? Like the use it or lose it was a really smart option in terms of permits to ensure that once they get the permits, they actually do build. No, right? Where's that?
Further questions? I recognize the member for Beaches East York.
Thank you very much. And to the member from Oshawa, thank you for your very informative, passionate speech. So there's so much in this bill. Heritage, development charges, parkland levies, rental replacement, Toronto Green Standards, the Port Conservation Authorities. Where do you start? Where do you begin? What troubles you the most? What are you hearing from your residents and, quite frankly, residents across Ontario? Because that's who we're hearing from. What is the worst part about this bill?
Back to the member.
God, so much to choose from. But I will. Oh, you know what? I'll read to you one of the letters that I received from a constituent, from Ron, who said, "I'm appealing you." Excuse me, that's not what he said. "I'm appealing to you to reconsider your position regarding Bill 23 and the proposal to allow the construction of houses on the currently protected areas of the Greenbelt." I'm going to pause and say this is to the Minister of Finance. He's not appealing my position. Goes on to say, "I feel that this proposal will not only set a precedent that in future may be challenged in court to allow further sensitive Greenbelt land to be purchased and developed for commercial and housing purposes. Two previous progressive Conservative governments took action to preserve Niagara Escarpment and the Oak Ridges Moraine. This is in part the legacy of the PC Party and hopes that this government has the foresight not to tarnish that legacy."
Response?
He goes on to say that the only winners here are the land speculators and developers who stand to reap millions of dollars in profits at the expense of every single person in Ontario in the foreseeable future. That's how it's perceived by the outside world.
We have time for one further question. I recognize the member for, and I hope I say it correctly, Mushkegowik, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you for my colleague for the presentation. You know, they asked you about affordable housing, and I want to ask you the same thing. No, I didn't see anything in the bill or even supportive housing. In my writing, there is no affordable, there is no supportive housing left. The list goes on. You know, the time to be able to qualify for them, and it takes years just to get able. Families are moving away to try to find supportive housing. They put their names on throughout Ontario to find, so they move away from their families, or they end up either in long-term care or they end up in hospitals. So I ask you, is there anything in this bill for affordable housing, but particularly for supportive housing?
A response? Back to the member.
Thanks, and no. There is nothing in this bill for supportive housing. And anybody who's laughing or suggesting otherwise, walk across and show us where, because there's nothing in this bill for supportive housing. This is not a bill for the average Ontarian. This is a bill that I think kind of answers that wish list for developers. And if the member opposite was going to take exception that I'm imputing motive, it shouldn't. I haven't. But it's really hard to talk about one without the other when there's so much money being made now as a result of these changes. And I guess it remains to be seen, Speaker, whether or not these houses are ultimately built and how many Ontarians get the housing that they need and deserve. This is not the province that we deserve, though. I'll say that much. Thank you.
That's our time for questions. Further debate. I recognize the member for Beaches East York.